Chris Carter here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host today. We got Nick Farabaugh coming from PennLive.com after we were both in the Mike Tomlin season-ending press conference. What did he say about the changes that do have to happen if he's sticking around? We'll discuss that. And George Pickens' future in jeopardy with the team might be something there. We'll talk all that here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things on the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find the show in your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of your daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content. We thank you for making us your first listen every day because we're your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the number one sportsbook in America. FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs more exciting. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets guaranteed. If you win your first bet, visit FanDuel.com to get started. More on them later. Nick Farabaugh is back on the show with us. Nick, we were both in for that Mike Tomlin press conference, and I felt like there was a lot of acknowledgments from Mike Tomlin about the shortcomings of the team. There was a lot of acknowledgments like, hey, things do have to change, and talking about accountability. What was your sense of like how he approached the way that he handled generally the questions about leadership and team construction, schematics, and things like that, as far as what has to change moving forward?
I think he kind of acknowledged that he has said a lot of this stuff before, and maybe there hasn't been change in results. And so he's going to let the actions do the talking a little more, right? I mean, one of the quotes that stuck out to me was words are hollow, which is true. I think he can say things are going to change. He can say things are going to drastically look different. But I've heard that before. He said that last year, that things were going to change. And so things did change this offseason, but the results didn't. And so I think the fact of the matter is I think Mike kind of has to look at himself a little bit, right? It's kind of a look in the mirror offseason for Mike Tomlin. He's going to have to change his style. He's going to have to really change his spots. And I think that's the significant thing. So I think he's looking at it as, man, listen, I'm not satisfied with 8 years of playoff winless football either. And so what changes can you make? I mean, he is entrusted in leading this franchise to those wins. The Steelers fan base, I think you and I have heard it very clearly over the last 4 days since the loss to Baltimore. They're just not happy. I think a lot of people have outright lost the faith in Mike Tomlin, and he's going to have to restore that somehow. And I think drastic changes, showing changes is going to have to be a big part of that. And so I think that's really where it comes from. And there's a lot of things to go in there with, whether that's schematically, personnel wise, if you're talking about coaching hires, everything is on the table, philosophically, even all of that needs to shift. When you are in this rut for 8 years and you're doing too many of the similar things. I think over the last few off seasons, Chris, there have been small tweaks outside of personnel related things, of course. I think now it's time for bigger tweaks to see what can happen.
I think that it's certainly something that needs to be considered. I also thought it was interesting how he pointed out, he's like, hey, I have changed. Like he kind of talked about that, like year to year, he has made changes in himself to try to be different. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about too, right? Like there were big changes this year. There were changes in how the quarterback position played. This offense did not rank in the bottom of the NFL this year. It ranked in the middle based off of how it finished, but it certainly took steps forward. And there were things that got that. And I will say that, like, look, this team this year was better than last year. And I think a big difference is the opponents. Like, for example, when the Steelers went on a 3-game skid last year, it was to 2-win teams like the Patriots and the Cardinals, and then they lost to the Colts. This year, when they went on their skid, it was to in Philadelphia, in Baltimore, the Chiefs, and then you lost to the Bengals. That one's not a good, but like I do feel like there were differences in how they got there. But you're right. At the end of the day, they got there, and as Mike Tomlin always says, it's a results-based business, and that's where he has to hold himself accountable. I want to play a clip from Mike Tomlin, a few different responses that he had as far as talking about changes, what things need to be different, and acknowledging what has to happen. Here was Mike Tomlin in his Tuesday press conference.
Mike, you said you imagine there'll be changes on a lot of levels. Does that start with your coaching staff?
I think changing in coaching staffs are a component of our business. I certainly don't think all of our coaches are under contract, and so change is a component of it, and I acknowledge it, but we're at the very early stages of making those type decisions and discussions.
Mike, does the franchise feel stuck right now?
I don't know that I've looked at it from that perspective. I'm certainly disappointed that I'm not working to prepare to play this week, and I've certainly felt that in recent years. But stuck is kind of a helpless feeling, and I don't know that I feel helpless.
Well, what gives you where does that optimism that you guys can work through this sort of place you've been in?
I don't know that I'm ready to be overly optimistic or sell optimism to you either. I'm just acknowledging what transpired and what has to happen and what is beginning to happen, and acknowledging the complexity and the amount of work that's ahead of us. Certainly feel capable, but definitely doesn't feel in the mood for optimism or the selling of optimism. I don't know that that's appropriate. It's disappointing not to be working, and so that's where we are.
Mike, do you have a plan for quarterback?
5.
In that same vein, it has been, in the same with the previous question, it's been 8 years since this team has won a playoff game. What about your approach do you feel needs to change?
No, that's what I was talking directly regarding when I answered that question. Certainly I'm open to adaptation and change, and have been. And so it's not a new discussion. It's not like I've been doing the same things over that stretch that you mentioned.
And I think that's part of what we're at here, Nick, is when you look at what Mike Tomlin was talking about here, the Steelers have made changes. And I think that's the thing here is that you look at from Mike Tomlin's, when he came to the Steelers, they had a bad offensive line. They had a franchise quarterback. They had a great defense. And within years' time, when that defense aged out, they built a very good, maybe even a great offensive line around it. Where they developed more playmakers on offense while they rebuilt the defense. That when that offense aged out, they built a defense that was top 5 for some years with Cam Hayward, and there's guys aging out. And I think that's where now you're at another crossroads where you're asking questions: how much longer does this defensive core have, and what else can they be developed now to kind of become a strength for the team, and can more of those strengths coexist at the same time? Because that's the tricky thing on the NFL. You got to hit, if you miss on your draft picks, you got to hit somewhere else to build and make it so that your weaknesses on your roster are minimal. And I think that's where the Steelers' problem has been of late. They've been rebuilding, trying to get answers for the weaknesses on their team, and they haven't found them quickly enough to coexist with another part of the team that's been an extreme strength. For example, if this version of this offense, granted, it didn't end the season well, but if this offense existed like in 2019 or 2020, granted, that's Ben Roethlisberger's years and everything, or even 2021, you're probably looking at a much more dangerous Steelers team, because they can do a little bit more with what was a team that needed to always win by rock fights in most of those years. That's where I think that he's acknowledging that, like, hey, they've got to figure some things out and become different to figure out some of those strengths a bit faster, so they can have more of a complete team than they've had in several years.
Yeah, it hasn't really ever lined up since the Super runs, right? Killer Bees era, the defense was terrible.
Yep.
Late Ben era, the offense was terrible, while the defense was incredible. And now it's just kind of very talented defense that hasn't performed at the highest level that should, and the offense is trying to find its kind of weight, and they're trying to put in a lot into it. Listen, I think changes here have tried to be implemented. I think that's maybe a better way to go about this. They've tried to implement change. I think the Arthur Smith hire had a very easy process to see. They were going to run the football, win with play action, and create explosive plays off play action. The issue is, I think the execution of that plan was not good. For one, I think you can question if Arthur Smith was the right hire for that. 2, I think the offensive line did not play well. And so I just think there were so many things that went into that. But the whole plan was, okay, we're going to bring in Russell Wilson. Russell Wilson's not going to have to play superhero. Well, he ended up having to play superhero. And when he did, I think you saw what happened. It kind of just fell apart. And so I think there were philosophical changes that were not enacted correctly. And so I think that also bears kind of watching, right? How do they kind of shift that and figure that out? Is it a personnel shift? Do they need better coaches? Does Arthur Smith need to change his spots? How does Mike Tomlin kind of look at all that? I think that's significant. And then on the defensive side of the ball, the Steelers have kind of changed their spots too, right? They blitz a little less now. They're very heavy in cover 3, but They want to run more man coverage, haven't. So these are just all schematic components I'm talking about. But there's plans that they tried to enact that I think were not successful in their kind of execution. So I think that's also part of it. It's maybe they tried to make changes, but maybe they weren't successful in it just because maybe the moves you made weren't correct. Maybe you put too much expectations on this one guy, et cetera, et cetera. And so all these things kind of come together and say, maybe the philosophical idea isn't the wrong part. Maybe it's the execution of that philosophical idea, because we see how much the Steelers want to be a team that wins in the trenches, runs the ball, makes explosive plays on play action. Well, I'll tell you who does that a lot. The Detroit Lions, the Philadelphia Eagles, all of these top teams, the Baltimore Ravens, all of these teams that are, at the top do a lot of these things, but they have executed that vision. So how do the Steelers get to that point? I think that's a key part too. It's not just what changes do I make philosophically, what changes do I make to my own personal thoughts. It's how about the execution of these thoughts goes about. How do you go about doing that and kind of getting to that part?
I'm right with you there, because like I brought this up when people were saying the philosophy has to change. They can't try to win in the trenches and hope that that's going to win you. Yeah, but there's a lot of teams playing like that right now. Like, yes, Jared Goff's playing well, but you know why? Because the Lions have a kick butt offensive line with a run game that can give them a balanced attack. Yes, Jalen Hurts is a heck of a playmaker, but you know why? Because he has an offensive line that kicks a lot of butt, and Saquon Barkley's running all over everybody. Lamar Jackson, yes, great quarterback, but we saw him and Derrick Henry are a different level of a threat than what you've seen. You don't have to be Joe Burrow throwing to two top tier wide receivers to win in this league.
Well, I'll even
throw that group didn't even make the playoffs this year.
Right. I'll even throw out, the Bills were a team that was kind of like this year's Bengals team for a while, where Allen was just kind of rocketing the ball around. And this year they have a absolutely dangerous kick butt run game. And this is probably the most dangerous version of that team. Even the Chiefs with Mahomes aren't a team that just makes him go out there and sling it around the yard 40 times. They can run that rock. So all these teams can run the ball at an extremely high level, and it matters. The Steelers won't have the quarterback that those teams have, which also will matter eventually. But I do think when you talk about the philosophical idea that Mike Tomlin kind of was trying to build, what they were trying to go after, it wasn't wrong, but I feel like the execution of it fell short. So how do you kind of fix that? I think that's the biggest question for me this offseason, because I don't think you can necessarily fix always your quarterback limitations, especially considering what's out there.
I agree. I think that's where you're looking at there. We got a lot to talk about. We got to talk about George Pickens, because I thought it was interesting the way Mike Tomlin answered and didn't answer some questions about George Pickens. We'll do that next here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Stick with us. We'll be right back. But first, I remind you, this show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the #1 sportsbook in America. Big upsets to game-winning drives. The NFL playoffs are better with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. And right now, new customers can bet $5. And if you hit on your first $5 bet, when you're a new customer, you can get $300 back in bonus bets. Winning that first $5 bet, you got to get on FanDuel today to take advantage of all these great opportunities. The wild card round is over. We move on to the divisional round, and here are some of your lines that you can see on FanDuel and make money off of. The Chiefs are 8.5-point favorites over the Texans. The Lions are 9.5-point favorites over the Commanders. The Eagles are 6.5-point favorites over the Rams, and the Ravens are 1.5-point favorites over the Bills. That's been flipping around a lot this week. So where will you put your money? Be sure to do so on FanDuel Sportsbook, the #1 sportsbook in America. Visit FanDuel.com today. That's FanDuel.com, and you can put your stakes down for your first $5 bet, and if you hit, you'll get $300 in bonus bets right in your FanDuel account. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter, here with Nick Farabaugh of PennLive.com, our Steelers reporter there. Nick, let's talk about George Pickens, because, there were some interesting responses that Mike Tomlin had today. I want to play the clips from him when he was asked some questions about George Pickens, and we'll chime in on that. But here was Mike.
Is it an off-season priority of the franchise to get George Pickens a contract extension?
We haven't had any conversations about pecking orders or priorities regarding any individuals contractually. We're not there yet. And I don't know that that's going to transpire this week. We're just still assessing what transpired in 2024. Those are more 2025 things.
Mike, how would you assess George? I'm sorry. How would you assess George's season than you did, particularly not the production, but maybe some of the other stuff? I mean, you've got a lot of letters from the league. You've got a lot of.
There's certainly, obviously, more room for growth there. I think he covered some ground in 2024, but there's certainly a heck of a lot more ground to be covered, and we'll see where it leads us.
Are you concerned 3 years in? I mean, he's a veteran now, and you're still sort of seeing the same problems pop up.
I'm always concerned about the growth and development of individuals, whether it's, skill relative to the positions that they hold, professionalism, maturity, or combinations of all of the above.
I know you don't talk about how you manage different players to us specifically, but with a now veteran 3 years in, do you consider changing your philosophy when it comes to coaching guys like that?
I think I'm always in consideration of changing my approach to get a desired result. Particularly when, it gets repetitive.
Any accuracy to the report that Pickens was late on Christmas Day for the game against the Chiefs?
Man, that's a few days back. I really don't know I have the answer to that, to be quite honest with you. I got a lot going on in pregame. I can't answer that definitively.
So Mike Tomlin leaves that last part open-ended. I'll just say this, Nick. I'm pretty sure that is the case. I don't scoop other people's business when they in journalism world. But when that question got asked, I was like, oh yeah, I didn't realize that we were at the point of someone was going to bring that up. But that's floated around quite a bit. And let's say I trust someone that said he was late for the Christmas Day situation. But in all seriousness, talking about George Pickens, this is a guy who we've talked about for years now. As a rookie, fine, whatever. But as a second-year player, the not blocking for Jaylen Warren, the attitudes, the rumors of him not being as hardcore in practice as other guys, and people kind of anonymously bringing him up, saying that people need to step up in practice, and everyone kind of like looking over at George. And then this year, when he. When this kind of stuff gets brought up, then you have questions of accountability, and anytime, Nick, you've been in the Steelers locker room, I've been in the Steelers locker room. I can't recall one time where when George Pickens, whether he's had 3 drops in the game like he did against the Bengals or fumbled in a big opportunity, where he acknowledged and said, I messed up. This was on me. I have to hold myself to this higher standard here. I don't think I've ever seen him in that moment. I think that's at the crux of the problem, that, as much as anyone has tried to get it out of him, this is just who he's been.
Yeah, we haven't seen that. And listen, what a talent he is on the football field.
Absolutely.
No question about it. And the Steelers are in a really hard spot because they need him. They do. And they're going to have to fix that. If it comes to the time where they want to move on, which could be this offseason, they're going to have to get somebody in there to replace it. But here's the thing. It's what he is doing off the field has bled onto the field too often, right, Chris? You talk about the Warren, not blocking for Warren. We talk about multiple times this year where he's just out there jogging on plays, not going full go. He's yanking guys down by the face mask. He's getting into fights with cornerbacks on Hail Mary attempts. He when he doesn't get targeted early in the game, and this is an observation that I've noticed, I know some other people have noticed, he doesn't get targeted early in the game, he kind of zones out the rest of the game, Chris.
And you can't do that. You can't do that.
And like, listen, I think there's a part of it where, Arthur Smith kind of got to know that, but also he shouldn't have to do it. He shouldn't have to. And so George cares, but George also has to lock in because he hurts the team with some of these antics. He gets called for in the first Cincinnati game, he gets called for 2 unsportsmanlike conducts after the play. There's just too much that is adding up. It's just becoming too much. And I think that's the significant thing. And, did he take some areas of growth? Sure. Was he crashing out on the sideline this year where, he's necessarily like, I remember his rookie year in Atlanta where he just he went off on the sideline. I didn't see him do that necessarily as much this year, but
I saw it one time, Nick. You remember the end of the Chiefs game on the field when it was like obvious they were going to lose and there were some offensive penalties and he was taking his helmet off and he was yelling and he was upset and looked like, and everyone's like, yeah, he should be upset. But if this report is true that he was late for the Christmas Day game, that's the same thing. And so that's where I'm just like, listen, I agree. George Pickens is a heck of a talent. And if you could make it work, he could be an unstoppable force at times with the plays that he makes. But you have a serious question for yourself, Steelers. Do you tie yourself to that man for 3 to 4 more years with a big deal there? Because if you do, you got to be mindful that you're going to have to police that 24/7. And and there's times it has quelled. Like after the Colts game, he blocked. He did not become a disaster or a problem for the Steelers the rest of the end of that season. That was fine last year, but it poked its head up again this year, and it's just you can't. I don't think you can live like that if you're the Steelers. And with the amount of free agent space that they have, the questions they have on where the direction they want to go on the offense, and how good George Pickens is I could see him being a trade target. But like, you know what? They'd love it for him to work out here and for him to be the number one guy, and they can trust that and build around him. But he's not delivered in the way of being a leader that steps up and isn't part of those problems in a way that makes it so that you can be confident that's going to be. So if you're the Steelers and you're the front office, you might need to explore other options. And I think that's something that not only should be on the table, but might actually be on the table right now.
Yeah, and listen, this is also a guy that this year was kind of his year to show that he was getting over that stuff. I think they traded Deontay Johnson in part to kind of see, Deontay Johnson was a big problem in the locker room. And he was there was a thought, right, that, okay, maybe Deontay is a bad influence on George. And maybe that's part of it. And obviously stuff has still come up with George. And so I think it's tough. But as you were mentioning, trading him, I think I haven't been given any indication. I think you're the same way as me. I haven't been given any indication that he's getting a contract this offseason. I don't know how he reacts to that. When Omar and Mike sit him down and tell him, we're not giving you money this year, I don't know how he reacts to that. I guess that depends on what he wants. Does he request a trade? Does he just say, okay, I'm good, and we'll work it out? I'll take this year. I don't know. We'll see. That's going to be the big question, but I don't think he's going to get a contract. And so that, I think, is the big thing. And the thing that I think comes in here, and this is I was talking with you earlier about this, Chris, before the show, is the Steelers have to create some leverage for themselves in this. They need another person to fall back on. You can't fall back on Calvin Austin III as your wide receiver one. You got to go out and make moves and get receivers. And I say receivers, not 1, 2, or 3 even receivers this offseason. That needs a change. And we've seen the Steelers before attack positions relentlessly under Omar Khan. The linebacker position, I remember the first offseason. The offensive line last season. Quarterback last season. The Steelers have undergone drastic changes to rooms before in order to fix them. I imagine the wide receiver room is going to be a significant part of that, and it's kind of up to George Pickens whether he's part of the solution or not.
Absolutely. I think that George is going to there's going to have to be a sort of come to Jesus moment for George where it's like, hey, this is the expectations, meet it, or there's got to be something figured out. And maybe that moment's already happened. Maybe the Steelers have already gone it there. And again, I'm not guaranteeing that he's not going to be here next year, but like you said, if they're not signing him to a contract, that puts the shelf as the Steelers in a tough situation, because then the year after that, you can't let him just hit free agency. I mean, sure, you'll get a comp pick, but that's not what you want for a guy of that caliber. So something to monitor there. I don't think that's not all. Things aren't all safe in paradise for George Pickens right now as far as his future with the Pittsburgh Steelers. And I think Mike Tomlin's comments and non-comments kind of confirm that on Tuesday. We'll get more to George Pickens throughout the week, but we got to talk about this offensive line and the plan for it. I want to talk to Nick about it. He's written a lot about it for Penn Live, and we've talked about a lot on this show. I want to talk about some of the things Mike Tomlin said and what they can try to do differently moving forward. We talked about Pat Meyer, all that next here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Chris Carter, Nick Farabaugh, stick with us. We'll be right back. But first, remind you, this show is also brought to you by LinkedIn. Growing your small business in 2025 comes down to how well you can hire. And let's face it, better hires start with the smarter insights. So that's where LinkedIn comes in. With the strongest hiring data available, LinkedIn helps you identify the right candidates, giving you the confidence to make the rest of the best decisions for your business. If you use LinkedIn, you can see, and it's a game changer when it comes to hiring the right fit. Small businesses are wearing a lot of hats, so every hire is crucial. LinkedIn gets that. That's why they connect you with the best candidates using data you won't find anywhere else. From unique skills to interests to the connections that you share, LinkedIn helps you find the right person for the job. In fact, 72% of small businesses say LinkedIn has helped them find high-quality candidates. I know from experience when building small businesses, you need to find the right teammates who won't drop the ball on you. LinkedIn helps you look over the best candidates available to find the trustworthy playmaker for your business. Hire smarter this year and find your next great hire on LinkedIn. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. We're back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Chris Carter, Nick Farabaugh. Nick, I'm not going to play a clip of Mike Tomlin. I'm just going to quickly go through his one of the answers that he gave us when it came to the offensive line, asking if there's something going on with the unit and what needs to happen. He says, certainly it didn't end the way that we would like as a collective and a smaller collective that you mentioned. He talked about the attrition they absorbed with some of the injuries, and they played a lot of younger players who he felt responded in a positive way. He said, but maybe they did fatigue mentally and physically down the stretch. Those are things that they are quote unquote unearthing. We begin this information gathering process, and he kind of talks about basically like they're still figuring out all the things that went into this. But Nick, we don't need to unearth this. Broderick Jones didn't grow in the way that you wanted to grow in his second year. And granted, acknowledging that like he's younger than both McCormick and Frazier, and that's part of what the problem is with the expectations were like, hey, his curve is going to be a little bit different than the average offensive lineman. And yes, Troy Fautanu, James Daniels being hurt, those were supposed to be two really good players in the offensive line that didn't get to play, but you still wanted to see this group coalesce a little bit better. And we brought this up about Pat Meyer on yesterday's show when I was talking with Alan Saunders about this, but I think that there's approaches that need to change if you're going to try to get more out of your offensive line. You need to see them find some consistency there, and maybe one of the things is finding a way to put these guys in the positions that they're most comfortable with. Like, for example, we've been wondering for years, it wasn't Broderick Jones drafted to be a left tackle, and he hasn't played left tackle a whole lot for the Steelers. And then you look back to Kendrick Green, who was a guard for most of college. He played center, and for the Steelers, wasn't good at all. Ended up going somewhere else. Performed a little bit better at guard with the Texans. And then there's Kevin Dotson, who's playing very well for the Rams. And I always mix up which guard side he was good at and didn't get play. I think he was the Steelers' right guard. Or no, was he the left guard? I always mix it up. But basically, the Steelers put him on the wrong side, on the side that he wasn't comfortable with. He said he wanted to be on the other side. He goes to the Rams, gets on that side, and he plays well for them. So clearly the Steelers have mismanaged things on this offensive line. And I think that's where, Nick, I do think when we're talking about changes, the changes not just with that coaching staff, but the entire approach for how they manage that offensive line need to flip and rather quickly for this team to succeed.
No, they do. Something I've been talking about for years. There is a such thing as a natural position for an offensive line. It's the same thing as a defensive lineman. Are you a 3 tech? Are you a nose? Are you a 5? Some guys can play all of those, but maybe a guy can play nose through 5, but is best as a 3, right? Mm-hmm. Same thing at offensive line. A guy can play all 5 spots, but maybe he's best at right guard. We'll play him at right guard. And that's what I think the Steelers have struggled with. And more importantly, I think with a guy like Broderick Jones, who we knew coming out of Georgia was inexperienced, raw, and needed to grow technically.
Yeah.
He was always a project. And to be quite honest with you, year 3 was probably always the year that he would break out, right? That would be the year where things clicked together and said, okay, Broderick, this is your time. He has not had a spot where he is known where he will play. I remember after last year, he just didn't know where he was going to play. He didn't know if he was going to play left or right. He had to rep both. This guy needs one spot. Stop the swing tackle nonsense. Stop that. Give him one spot and let him refine himself. Fautanu is a little different because he was an experienced player that came in very polished. And actually, even though he played left tackle, he's more comfortable on the right side. He's kind of a weird exception to the rule, I guess you could say. But you look at when the Steelers have stuck guys at their natural spots. Zach Frazier, boom, just takes off like a lightning rod. He was a top 5 center in the league this year, honestly. McCormick in his spot. 4th round rookie was raw. He looked raw at times, but he played pretty well for a rookie that was going to need a year or two to go starter level. He played well, like honestly, for relative to expectation, stepping in for Daniels. And so I just think that they need to give guys one spot. So they need to sit down with Broderick Jones. They need to sit down with Troy Fautanu and say, all right, guys, you're playing at right tackle. You're playing at left tackle. And that's all they should train at all offseason. And so that's going to be something significant. They're overvaluing versatility. Versatility matters, but what it matters for really is the depth players. It matters for Spencer Anderson and Ryan McCollum. It doesn't really matter for Broderick Jones. That's kind of where I'm at with that. And so I think these guys need one spot that they can really focus on and can technically develop.
And technically develop and then coalesce. I think that's the other part of this, right? Is that like individually you can kick butt, but you can still do that in a way that looks lost. And again, like I can't help but look back at that clip of the time when Moore and Broderick pulled into each other. I still think that was Broderick that pulled in correctly on that play. But they have to be on the same page. And I think that was something that, and again, that takes time to develop, right? Like, again, like I go back to, Pouncey and DeCastro, they became all pro guys lining up together next to each other for the better part of a decade. And I think it was DeCastro's second year where like in the first play, in the first drive of the first game of the season, he tried to cut block somebody and he accidentally took out Pouncey's knee and knocked him out for the entire season. And it was just like, that was a pretty big disaster, but it takes time for lines to gel and figure out, okay, I'm good at this. You're good at this. Let's play. Let's play this way. And I think that's where the Steelers, one, they have to get guys to be at their strength, but then two, they also have to get guys to be able to play to play together at a high level so that they can be an offensive line unit. Again, we're talking about if the Steelers want to be a real contender, they're going to be, and again, they're a playoff contender. They've consistently been that. They've made the playoffs 4 out of the last 5 seasons. No one doubts that they can get there with the way that they're currently constructed. The question is, can they be a team that can consistently beat teams, not even consistently beat, but be a team that can go into the playoffs and then be able to beat other playoff teams. And again, they beat 4 playoff teams this year. So it's not like they can't beat playoff teams, but you need to be able to play. They wanted to be able to play with a physical style of offense that would work in January and make it easy, like you said, on Russell Wilson, so he didn't have to play hero ball. But that never developed. And if you don't find out an answer to that, you're going to put your offense in an even worse situation while your defense is aging out. And that's where I think that time could be running out on the Steelers if they don't figure that out.
Right. And I can't help but start to think back to the start of the year where we literally saw in a game them rotate right tackles.
Mm-hmm.
And then they rotated guards as well, McCormick and Anderson. Stop doing that. Like, just give guys direct. Like, offensive line is not a position you rotate. It's a rhythm-based position in many regards. That also hurts coordination. Broderick was playing, right tackle, then flipped to left for a week, then went back to right, and it was like, where's he going? And he kind of looked like a guy that didn't really have an idea of where he was going to go all year. I also just think you talk about, the run game, man. That's coaching to some point. Broderick pulling at the same play, Moore's pulling. There were at least 3 or 4 plays every single game. You could point out every single game on run plays where they just made the wrong assignment. Whether this guy combos when he's not supposed to, this guy's supposed to reach, he doesn't, this guy goes the wrong way, whatever. There were so many blown assignments by different players. It wasn't like one guy. I can point to every single player on that line, the tight ends, the receivers. It's someone blowing it. That's coordination, that's coaching. And so you talk about changes, we talked about the start of the show, changes that need to be made. I think one of them is that offensive line coach. I truly do believe that. Meyer's been here for 3 years. And while I think technically, as you mentioned, I think individually at times there has been moments of growth. I think Frazier's start, I think how McCormick played. I do think that there have been individual growths in this line, but I don't think as a unit, as a team, they play like a cohesive unit. And I don't think we've seen the unit grow like it should. And so I think that's a significant issue. And I think it requires philosophical changes to the coaching of that position.
Yeah, I think it's going to require some sort of change. They need some upgrades there. They need that group to be upgraded in general, and they've already invested the talent into it. And maybe they're investing more. Maybe there's still another guard that you could add to this offense that can complete that offensive line. But certainly they need to be more together in how they play. But again, we're covering all of that throughout the offseason. It's still a very, very extremely early stages of the offseason. One thing I'll note, if you're one person, we're talking about change. You look back at the history of when Steelers usually make coaching changes under Mike Tomlin, it usually comes within a week after this press conference. So stay tuned for if the Steelers are going to make moves, for announcements to come very soon. In that, we'll be covering that all here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, as will Nick Farabaugh. Nick, let them know where they can find all that great coverage that you provide.
Yeah, you can find me on X at FarabaughFB. Make sure to read the stuff over at PennLive.com. Check out the YouTube channel, Steelers Breakdown, as well.
Absolutely. He is Nick Farabaugh. I'm Chris Carter here for the Locked On Steelers podcast. As always, you can find the show on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoyed. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of your daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content. We thank you for making us your first listen every day, because we're your team every day. And reminder to subscribe to me to follow me if you want on social media at Carter Critiques at all the different handles, and read more at the Pittsburgh Post Gazette. We'll be back tomorrow with another episode here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. We'll see you then.